Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a true titan of the energy world, a company whose influence is felt in, well, just about every corner of the global economy.
We're talking about Chevron Corporation.
hmm
And this isn't just another energy company. It's an institution, really, with roots stretching back nearly 150 years.
And here's the hook that I think really frames this entire conversation. Since 2020, Chevron has been the last oil and gas company left in the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
Right. ExxonMobil got dropped. Chevron stayed.
And that single fact, I mean, it just speaks volumes about its financial power, its strategic importance, and just its sheer scale. We're talking about a company worth over $200 billion.
So our mission today is to give you a really clear, impartial masterclass on how this behemoth actually works. We're going to trace its family tree right back to the famous Standard Oil breakup.
And then we'll map out its modern global structure. I mean, how does it actually find, move, and then sell energy across the entire planet?
Exactly. And we're going to dissect its biggest strategic moves, like the huge Hess acquisition, and also get into the very significant legal and environmental battles it's constantly fighting.
And this matters to you because, honestly, if you understand how a vertically integrated supermajor like Chevron works, you get this crucial insight into global energy markets.
It connects everything, from climate debates to the real nature of high-stakes corporate power and how that power can shape and sometimes even dictate international policy.
So let's start at the very beginning, the birth of a titan in the American West.
Okay, so Chevron's story doesn't just start with the Standard Oil breakup. It's actually tied to the very beginning of the oil industry in California itself. How did that happen?
You have to go all the way back to 1876. There had been some small discoveries before, but the moment everyone points to is when a company called Star Oil struck crude in the Pico Canyon oil field.
Just north of Los Angeles. Right, and it wasn't a gusher, not at first. Maybe 25 barrels a day. But that discovery is really seen as the start of the modern, commercially viable oil industry in California.
It's that classic aha moment that just snowballs into a whole industry. So Star Oil was the seed.
It was. And the people who turned that seed into a real corporation were a group that included Charles N. Felton and Lloyd Tevis. They formed the Pacific Coast Oil Company, or PCOC, in 1879.
Okay.
They absorbed Star Oil and came in with some serious funding, $1 million, which was a fortune back then. And very quickly, PCOC became the biggest oil company on the West Coast.
And when you're the biggest player in a region, you eventually get the attention of the biggest player in the world.
John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Exactly. They couldn't ignore an asset that dominant. So in 1900, Standard Oil just acquired them.
And then came the big one. The 1911 Supreme Court decision to break up the Standard Oil Trust, which just completely remade American business.
And the West Coast assets of that trust were reorganized. A few years earlier, in 1906, PCOC had already become the Standard Oil Company, California. People just called it SoCal, or sometimes CalSo.
And that is the direct, traceable ancestor of the Chevron we know today.
That's the one.
You know, we often talk about that breakup, but what was the actual practical impact on SoCal? It wasn't just about splitting into 34 companies.
No, it forced them to think differently. After the breakup, SoCal was legally restricted. They could only use the famous Standard name in a few places: the Pacific Coast states, Nevada, and Arizona.
So they couldn't just rely on that powerful legacy brand everywhere else.
Right. That legal problem was actually a huge catalyst. It forced them to expand globally and create new brands, a new identity.
And that's where the name Chevron comes from.
It is. The name itself was first used for some retail products back in the 1930s. And for a while, outside their home territory, they used the name colossal too, from about 1946 to 1955.
But no matter what they called themselves, their ambition was global. They quickly became one of the Seven Sisters.
Seven Sisters. I mean, for those who don't know, this was a group of 7 absolutely dominant petroleum companies that basically controlled the world's oil supply from the 40s through the 70s. An incredible era of corporate power.
And a huge part of that dominance was cemented by one single strategic move they made decades earlier: the Saudi Arabia connection.
This is where you see corporate history just slam right into geopolitics.
Yeah.
In 1933, California Standard secured a massive concession in Saudi Arabia.
That one deal changed everything. Not just for the company, but for the entire Middle East.
It was pivotal. It led directly to the first big Saudi oil discovery in 1938. And then 10 years later, in 1948, they hit the jackpot.
The Ghawar fields.
The Ghawar field, the largest conventional oil field in the world even today. And the subsidiary that ran all of this was eventually called the Arabian American Oil Company,
Aramco.
Aramco. So it was Chevron's ancestor, SoCal, that literally built the foundation for the modern Saudi oil state.
And of course, Aramco was eventually fully nationalized by the Saudi government by 1980. It's just an incredible historical footprint for one company to have.
It really is. But back on the domestic front, the company really grew by, well, you could call it merger mania. They just kept acquiring their competitors.
The first really colossal one was in 1984.
That was the deal for Pittsburgh-based Gulf Oil. And at the time, it was the largest corporate merger in history. The price was enormous, but it gave them huge reserves and a whole distribution network.
And that's when they officially became Chevron Corporation.
Exactly. That merger was the trigger. They finally retired the old SoCal name and adopted the retail brand they'd been building for 50 years.
Which just set the stage for the next big wave of deals in the early 2000s.
It did. In 2001, they bought Texaco for $45 billion. Now, Texaco was another old rival, and they already had history together. They'd formed a joint venture called Caltex back in the 30s.
And the merger was so big, they actually renamed the whole company Chevron Texaco for a few years.
From 2001 to 2005, yeah. And I've read that back in the day, SoCal and Texaco were sometimes called the Terrible Twins.
The Terrible Twins?
For their aggressive business practices. So bringing them together, I mean, you can imagine the kind of corporate DNA they created. It was all about growth and hardball negotiations.
And the shopping spree kept going. 2005, they bought Unocal.
Right, for about $18.4 billion. And this deal was really interesting because Unocal wasn't just about oil. It brought in these major assets in Southeast Asia.
And that's not all it did.
No. Critically, it boosted Chevron's proven reserves by about 15% overnight, and it made them a major global producer of geothermal energy.
That's a theme we have to come back to, this tension between fossil fuels and their moves into alternative energy.
For sure. But fast forward almost 2 decades, and they proved that their appetite for huge deals was still there. I'm talking about the 2023 deal for Hess Corporation.
This one was huge, a $53 billion all-stock deal.
And it was laser-focused. It wasn't just about getting bigger. It was about getting access to 2 really crucial things: new U.S. shale plays, and, most importantly, Hess's big stake in the oil fields off the coast of Guyana.
Guyana is one of the hottest oil exploration spots in the world right now.
Yeah.
So this deal put Chevron right in the middle of a new boom. But it wasn't exactly a smooth process.
Not at all. The Hess shareholders approved it, but then ExxonMobil, who was already a partner in Guyana, stepped in.
What was their argument?
They filed an arbitration claim. They argued they had the right of first refusal on Hess's shares in the Guyana project, basically saying, hey, we should have gotten the first shot at buying that.
So you have 2 of the biggest supermajors on the planet fighting over this, holding up a $53 billion deal.
It was a massive standoff. The arbitration dragged on, but eventually the regulators weighed in. In September 2024, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, they cleared the merger.
But with a condition.
A very important condition. They refused to allow the Hess CEO, John Hess, to take a seat on Chevron's board. It was a clear signal from the regulators about concerns over too much market consolidation and, potential undue influence. So in the end, it was a very hard-fought win for Chevron.
Okay, that history brings us right up to the modern Chevron. So now we need to look under the hood. How does this $200 billion engine actually run?
And to do that, you have to understand its structure as a vertically integrated supermajor.
Let's break that down for everyone. When we say vertically integrated, what does that mean in simple terms?
It means they own the entire chain from start to finish. They don't just find the oil, they get it out of the ground, they move it, they refine it into gasoline and other products, and then they sell it to you at the pump.
And that chain is broken into 3 parts: upstream, midstream, and downstream.
Exactly. So let's start at the source, upstream. This is the high-risk, high-reward world of exploration and production.
And their upstream footprint is just massive.
It's enormous. On any given day, they're producing nearly 3 million barrels of oil equivalent. And while they're all over the globe, the 2 biggest hubs are North America, with about 1.2 billion barrels of oil equivalent, and Eurasia, which is even bigger, at 1.4 billion.
And when you say North America, you really have to talk about the Permian Basin. It's the heart of the U.S. energy boom.
The Permian is absolutely core to their operations. They have something like 11,000 wells spread across 4 million acres of West Texas and New Mexico.
And they're not new to the game there.
Not at all. They're a legacy player. They were one of the original developers. In fact, they produced their 5 billionth barrel of oil from the Permian way back in 2011.
Wow.
And they're also pushing hard in deep water exploration, mostly in the Gulf of Mexico, with these incredibly complex fields like Tahiti and Blind Faith.
And that expansion is happening right now with projects like the new Anchor Field.
Anchor Field is a perfect example of the scale we're talking about. It's a $5.7 billion project in the deepwater Gulf. It just started producing oil in August 2024.
And what kind of output are we talking about?
It's designed to pump 75,000 barrels of crude oil and 28 million cubic feet of natural gas every single day. I mean, the engineering challenges on these projects are just mind-boggling.
So outside of North America, some of their biggest bets are on natural gas, right? Especially in Australia.
Yeah, Australia is home to their largest single projects in the entire world. You have the Gorgon Gas Project, which costs $43 billion.
$43 billion.
And then right next door, you have the Wheatstone LNG development, another $29 billion project. These aren't just supplying Australia. They are fundamental to the LNG supply for all of Asia.
And Gorgon has become this real focal point in the climate debate because Chevron is trying to pivot toward carbon capture.
That's right. They're spending a lot of money to try and capture the CO2 that's produced with the gas and then inject it deep underground. That's a huge technical challenge.
And the big question is, is it a genuine commitment to decarbonization, or is it more of a regulatory move to justify continuing this massive gas production?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. Either way, the scale of the technology is it's breathtaking.
And they're still huge in their legacy regions, too. Kazakhstan, West Africa.
Absolutely. Kazakhstan is vital. They're involved in the giant Tengiz and Karachaganak projects. In West Africa, they're big in Angola, and they have a major joint venture in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. These are the places where you see the real geopolitical risk involved in securing the world's energy supply.
So once you have all that oil and gas, you have to move it. And that brings us to the midstream segment, transport.
Right. And historically, this was actually a part of the chain that Chevron didn't focus on owning as much as its rivals did. They used a lot of third-party pipelines.
But that's changed.
It changed in a big way in 2021 when they bought Noble Midstream Partners. This was a very deliberate move to complete their vertical integration puzzle.
So what did Noble give them that they needed so badly?
It gave them control, total control over getting the crude from the well to the refinery. They got pipelines and gathering assets right in the heart of the Permian and DJ basins. It's all about efficiency.
No more paying a middleman.
Exactly. You control the flow, you control the cost, you buffer yourself from price swings. It cements that full cycle control.
And for getting it across the oceans, they have their own fleet, the Chevron Shipping Company.
They do. And as a fun little detail, the ships are often named after company directors. One of them was famously named after Condoleezza Rice, who was on their board for a long time.
I remember that. They renamed it later, didn't they?
They did. It's now the Altair Voyager.
Okay, so that brings us to the final piece, downstream. This is the part we all see. The refineries, the chemicals, the gas stations.
This is the final link in the chain. Chevron has 5 active refineries in the U.S., including massive ones in Richmond and El Segundo in California. They also have partnerships in 7 other refineries around the world in places like Singapore and South Korea.
And the chemical business?
That's mostly handled through a 50-50 joint venture with Phillips 66. It's called Chevron Phillips Chemical, or CPChem, and it's a giant in its own right, making plastics, industrial chemicals, all sorts of things.
But the most public face is obviously the gas stations, and the branding there is, well, it's a bit of a mess because of all the history we talked about.
It's a mix of names, for sure. The main brand in the U.S. is, of course, Chevron. There are almost 7,000 of them, mostly on the West Coast, in the South, and Texas.
And they have the world's largest one, right?
They do, at a place called Terrible's Roadhouse in Nevada. It's a gigantic facility.
And then you still see the Texaco brand around.
Yep. About 1,300 locations still use the Texaco name, mostly in the South. And then internationally, the big brand is Caltex.
That's the one you see all over Asia and Africa.
Right. But even that has been complicated. They actually sold their stake in Caltex Australia back in 2015.
But then they came back.
They did. They must have realized it was a mistake to leave that market, so they bought another company's assets and then relaunched the Caltex brand there in 2022. It just shows how aggressive they are about market access.
The scale of everything we just talked about, it just requires an unbelievable amount of money. Which brings us to their financial picture and some of the huge strategic shifts they've made recently. starting with 2022.
2022 was a wild year for the whole energy sector. After Russia invaded Ukraine, oil prices just skyrocketed. And for Chevron, that meant record revenues of $246 billion.
And profits.
Record profits, $36.5 billion. I mean, they were just swimming in cash.
And what a company does with that kind of windfall, that's where things got really controversial.
It was a defining moment.
Yeah.
Just days after announcing those massive profits, Chevron announced a $75 billion stock buyback program.
$75 billion.
And they increased their dividend. And the response, especially from the Biden administration, was immediate and very heated.
The criticism was pretty straightforward, right? Why are you giving all this money back to shareholders instead of, say, increasing production to lower prices at the pump or investing it all in clean energy?
That was exactly the argument. But Chevron's move gave a really clear window into their strategy. They were prioritizing returning cash to shareholders over massive new spending on exploration or refining. For critics, that $75 billion buyback was proof that the industry was focused on short-term rewards.
And what's even more striking is that at the same time, they were planning to cut their workforce.
It really underscores that relentless focus on efficiency. In early 2025, they announced plans to cut 20% of their workforce by the end of 2026. The goal was to slash payroll by $2 to $3 billion.
So record profits, huge shareholder payouts, and deep job cuts all happening at once.
It's the cycle of a supermajor trying to please the capital markets.
And speaking of big strategic shifts, maybe the most symbolic one in their entire history was the decision to leave California and move their headquarters to Texas.
I mean, this was huge. Chevron had been headquartered in California since 1879, but starting in 2022, they sold off their massive campus in San Ramon and started shifting everything to Houston.
And they made it official in August 2024.
Yep. The full move to Houston was set for January 2025, and their CEO, Mike Wirth, was very public about why. He said that California's regulations were discouraging investment.
So it wasn't just about saving money.
No, it was a political statement. It was a symbolic rejection of California's climate policies and a huge bet on the legal and political environment in Texas as the future of American energy.
And moving from domestic politics to global ones, Chevron is always walking this tightrope in geopolitical hotspots, and there's no relationship more complicated than the one with Venezuela.
Venezuela is a complete roller coaster, and it's all dictated by whatever the policy is in Washington, D.C.
Because of the sanctions on the Maduro regime?
Exactly. For years, their operations were severely restricted. But then in 2022, the Biden administration relaxed some of those restrictions.
And what was the idea behind that?
The thinking was it could help stabilize global oil supplies and maybe use Chevron as a sort of go-between.
Right.
But the rules were really strict.
How so?
Chevron could pump the oil, but they couldn't sell it to anyone connected to Russia or Iran. And most importantly, none of the profits could go directly to the Venezuelan state oil company, PDVSA.
So Chevron was basically just acting as a debt collector.
That's a good way to put it. They were recouping money they were owed. But then, of course, the pendulum swung back.
Right.
In February 2025, the Trump administration came in and revoked their license completely. All operations had to stop.
But then it changed again.
Just 6 months later, in August 2025, they got a new license from the Treasury and resumed exports to the U.S. almost immediately. It just shows how Chevron can be used as a tool of U.S. foreign policy, switched on and off.
And sometimes they have to leave a country entirely, not because of policy, but because of ethics, like in Myanmar.
Yeah, in January 2022, Chevron announced they were pulling out of Myanmar. They cited the rampant human rights abuses and the collapse of the rule of law after the military coup there.
We've even seen their operations get hit by protests, like in Kazakhstan.
That was in January 2022. There were massive protests across Kazakhstan because of rising fuel prices, and Chevron had to temporarily cut production at their huge Tengiz field. It's a reminder that this massive global supply chain can be really fragile at the local level.
So to wrap all of this complexity up, they have their corporate slogan, which they launched back in 2007.
The Human Energy Company.
The Human Energy Company.
That's very intentional, obviously. It's meant to project this positive spirit. But as we get into their investments in alternative energy and contrast that with their environmental controversies, you really have to ask what human energy means and what its real price is.
Okay, let's pivot now to how Chevron is trying to position itself for the future. I mean, they are obviously a fossil fuel giant, but they're also making some pretty significant investments in alternative energy.
They are, and their history here is actually pretty complex. They've been involved in geothermal, Solar, biofuels, hydrogen, a bit of everything. And it's important to remember, after they bought Unocal in 2005, Chevron was, for a time, the world's largest producer of geothermal energy.
Great. If they were the world's largest, why did they sell off those big geothermal assets in 2017? That seems to go against the idea of moving toward a lower carbon future.
And that is the central paradox of their strategy. They sold them partly because geothermal, while it is low carbon, just doesn't offer the same high returns as a successful oil and gas project. It's a different financial model.
So they divested from that, but they're still active in other renewables.
They are, and often in ways that actually support their existing oil and gas operations.
What's an example of that?
Well, back in 2011, they launched this huge 29-megawatt solar-to-steam facility. But it wasn't to sell electricity to the grid.
It was for what they call enhanced oil recovery.
Exactly. They were using the steam generated by solar power to make it easier to extract heavy oil from the ground. So you're using solar power to produce more oil more efficiently.
That makes perfect sense. You're lowering the carbon intensity of your production, but you're not actually replacing the oil itself.
Right. But they are also making some very long-term frontier tech bets, like fusion power.
Fusion.
Yeah, in the last few years, they've taken investment stakes in two different fusion power companies, Zap Energy and Terrier Technologies. And they're also clearly serious about hydrogen. In 2023, they bought a majority stake in a hydrogen storage facility in Utah that's said to be the world's largest.
And very recently, they've moved into the battery supply chain with their first lithium project.
That was announced in 2025. They acquired a huge amount of land in Texas and Arkansas to go after lithium that's found in brine deep underground in a geological layer called the Smackover Formation.
So they're trying to become a full-spectrum energy company, not just oil and gas.
That seems to be the long-term goal. But no matter how much they invest in these new technologies, you just can't ignore the immense climate impact of their core business over the decades.
And the numbers are just staggering.
They're stark. Over its entire history, Chevron has produced something like 58,598 million tons of carbon dioxide.
Which puts them under intense regulatory pressure.
And leads to major fines, like the one their joint venture, CP got hit with in 2022 for violating the Clean Air Act.
How much was that?
It was a $118 million penalty. It was because they weren't properly flaring excess gases at 3 of their plants in Texas, which led to a lot of extra air pollution.
And the irony is that all of their infrastructure, their refineries, their offshore platforms, they're all vulnerable to the extreme weather that's linked to climate change.
It's a negative feedback loop. They even acknowledge it in their own risk reports.
Yeah.
Hurricanes, flooding. It all threatens their assets and drives up their costs.
Which brings us to probably the most complex and controversial part of Chevron's entire legacy, the environmental disaster in Lago Agrio, Ecuador, which they inherited when they bought Texaco.
This case is often called the Amazon Chernobyl, and it's just a defining story in corporate accountability. From the 60s to the 90s, Texaco was operating in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and critics accused them of systematically dumping billions of gallons of toxic waste and crude oil directly into the rainforest.
And the impact on the local and indigenous communities there was just devastating.
It destroyed the environment and caused widespread, severe health problems for people who were drinking and bathing in poisoned water. And after decades of legal battles, an Ecuadorian court found Chevron liable in 2011.
And ordered them to pay how much?
$9.5 billion in damages.
A $9.5 billion judgment. How does a company like Chevron respond to that?
They refused to pay a single cent. They moved all of their assets out of Ecuador and launched one of the most aggressive corporate legal counterattacks you will ever see. They famously vowed to fight it until hell freezes over.
And the main target of that counterattack was the American lawyer who represented the Ecuadorians, Stephen Donziger.
The legal war against Donziger is what really stands out. Chevron filed a racketeering lawsuit against him in the U.S., claiming the entire Ecuadorian judgment was based on fraud. And in 2018, an international tribunal in The Hague actually ruled in Chevron's favor.
But there's a huge asterisk on that ruling, isn't there?
A massive one. A key witness that Chevron used against Donziger, a man named Alberto Guerra, later admitted under oath that Chevron had paid him over $1 million and coached him for 50 days to give false testimony.
So the star witness admitted he lied after being paid.
Essentially, yes. But the U.S. legal system's response to Donziger himself was, well, critics call it unprecedented.
What happened?
A judge ordered Donziger to turn over his computer and his phone. He refused, citing attorney-client privilege. The judge then hit him with criminal contempt charges.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really chilling. The U.S. Attorney's Office declined to prosecute the case. So the judge appointed a private law firm to prosecute Donziger in the court's name.
And that private law firm
Had previously represented Chevron.
Wait, let me just want to be clear on this. A private law firm that had worked for Chevron was appointed by a judge to criminally prosecute the lawyer who had just won a multi-billion-dollar case against Chevron.
That is correct. The outcome was that Donziger was put under house arrest for 993 days and was eventually convicted. Critics argue his sentence was longer than the legal maximum for that kind of offense. He was disbarred, his assets were frozen.
It sounds like they were trying to make an example out of him.
The argument from critics is that Chevron used its bottomless financial and legal power to crush him and to send a message to anyone else who might think about challenging them in court.
That is just a staggering story. And that kind of disparity exists even here in the U.S., right? In Los Angeles with their urban drilling operations.
It's real contrast. Critics point out that in lower-income areas of L.A., you have active oil wells right next to homes and schools. But in wealthy areas like Beverly Hills, the drilling operations are hidden inside these big windowless buildings, like the one at Beverly Hills High School they call the Tower of Hope.
Out of sight, out of mind.
And beyond just hiding them, critics accuse them of improperly abandoning old wells, leaving behind toxic sites that pose ongoing health risks to nearby residents. It's cited as evidence of a pattern. Maximize profit, minimize cleanup costs, and use your legal power to fight anyone who complains.
Hashtag, tag, outro.
Wow, this has been a truly monumental deep dive. We've
Wow.
traced Chevron all the way back to Star Oil in SoCal, watched it become a seven-sister that laid the groundwork for Saudi Aramco, and tracked its growth through these landscape-changing acquisitions.
Gulf, Texaco, Unocal, and of course the huge, hard-fought $53 billion deal for Hess. And we've dissected this breathtakingly massive vertical engine that dominates everything from the Permian Basin to Australian LNG.
A scale that was really captured by those record $36.5 billion in profits in 2022, and that immediately controversial $75 billion stock buyback. A move that was then underscored by the symbolic decision to move their entire headquarters to Houston.
And we really tried to connect the dots on this deep, contradictory relationship they have with the climate and with communities. On one side, you have these forward-looking investments in solar, hydrogen, fusion power, even lithium in the Smackover Formation.
And on the other, you have major fines for Clean Air Act violations and this decades-long devastating legacy of the Lago Agrio contamination, a $9.5 billion judgment they fought with a legal campaign that included the unprecedented prosecution of the plaintiff's lawyer, Stephen Donziger.
It really forces you to synthesize these two opposing ideas.
It does. Their slogan is the Human Energy Company, and is meant to sound positive, like they're helping the world change. But when you contrast their investments in fusion, which is all about the future of human ingenuity, with the legal wars they've waged over toxic dumping, which is all about avoiding a legacy of the past, it raises a really powerful question for you to think about.
So what's the final takeaway here?
I think the key insight is this. Chevron is betting that its sheer corporate scale and its technological know-how will keep it dominant for decades to come. But what truly defines the cost of that human energy in the 21st century? What is the real human and environmental price of maintaining that dominant vertically integrated position when that position is secured by both cutting-edge technology and by decades of aggressive, high-stakes litigation against the very people who claim to have been harmed by your past methods? That is the real measure of the energy they harness.